You're watching Beyond Markets, and welcome. I'm Kenneth Igbomo, and on today's show, we'll explore the adequacy of South Africa's national dialogue ahead of the elections. You can join the conversation with the hashtag Beyond Markets, and you can also follow my handle at Kenneth Igbomo. Now, independent strategy advisor Shawn Hagedorn says South Africa is among the world's most unequal countries, and until inequality's policy hegemony is toppled, the effectiveness of the country's national dialogue will be subverted by false beliefs. Shawn Hagedorn joins me to discuss the elections in South Africa. Thank you so much for joining me on the show today, Shawn. I'd first like to start with you giving me an overview of how the elections have progressed so far.
So the election happens on Wednesday, and the expectations are very mixed in terms of the results that are expected at the national level and the provincial level. And the expectations are not particularly positive in terms of this introducing a lot of positive change, whatever the actual electoral outcomes are.
All right, then you are of the opinion that the messaging and policies and the rallies that they've had so far, the national dialogue is not what you think it should be. I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
Right. Well, to put it really simply, none of the political parties or really even among the thought leaders, no one's putting forth a comprehensive, workable economic growth plan. And so in that respect, what you would hope an election would do with such high poverty and such low growth is it would be a debate about effective, workable economic plans. And that isn't what's happened. Mostly the discussions have focused on corruption and sort of populist policies which aren't going to produce growth, which is what's mostly needed.
All right, we'll get to some of those policies in a bit, but first I'd just like you to, let's backtrack a little and speak about how the economy has performed, especially since Cyril Ramaphosa came into office in 2017.
Well, people were hoping to get to at least 3% growth sort of numbers. And so population growth is important to keep in mind. It's about 1.7. So you have to get to 2% to really have any sort of growth in the economy on a per person basis. And so there have been some pretty big setbacks. A lot of them relate to Eskom and the power outages. And so the industrial side of the economy certainly has not been performing well. And then at the sort of the retail side, which is a very significant part of the economy, a lot of the households are very much over indebted, and there's just really no sort of growth driver in the economy. So this year the economy may not even grow at 1%. I mean, so on a per person basis, there's almost certain to be a contraction of incomes.
All right, then another worrying trend, however, is still the unemployment in the country. We're seeing it's trending around just over 27%.
Right, and the prospects are not at all good. And it's the same thing. You have to grow the economy to create jobs. And then the other thing, which is very sad and troubling, is that a lot of jobs were created, let's say, over the last 9 or 10 years, really for sort of political gain. And a lot of those jobs, for instance, at Eskom comes up a lot. It's by international standards, its workforce might be a third larger than what it should be. And political reasons, it'll be very difficult to change that.
All right, but when you look at the development outcomes in South Africa since, democracy, I'd just like you to share how you think things have progressed.
I think it's been very disappointing. I mean, so if you were to use the broadest statistics, and those are the ones that are most difficult to sort of stage, manage, and manipulate. So in 1994, probably the poverty rate then was well into the 80% level, and then it bottomed out about 10 years ago at about 60%. And then since then, it's been ratcheting higher to where now it's probably about 66%. And really the prospects of that improving are not good at all. I mean, over the next 10 years, there just isn't any sort of growth initiative which would suggest that you're going to have a decline in poverty or unemployment. And then what we're talking about today is that you have this really important election, and none of the political parties are really putting forth a comprehensive, workable solution.
All right, you don't think there's a workable solution from the parties, but we've seen quite a lot of talk around corruption. We've seen talk around, creating accountability. But I think these are also some valid conversations to have, especially since we've been hearing about all the state capture that's been going on in South Africa.
Right, and so they talk about the 9 lost years under the Jacob Zuma presidency, and there was a lot of corruption, patronage, and the like. And growth was for the most part quite slow. And so corruption is a huge problem. The education outcomes is a huge problem. But that, to a large degree, is separate and distinct from having a growth strategy. You need to improve education outcomes, you need to reduce corruption, but you absolutely have to have a growth strategy. And in this election, what's really disappointing is you would have thought there would have been a really active debate about what to do about that, and that's what hasn't happened, and then that's why people there's a lot of angst. There are not positive expectations about, well, after the election things are going to come right. It doesn't seem like that at all.
Would you say the democratic institutions in South Africa are performing well or performing below par?
The Constitution is doing what it's supposed to do. The political process is doing what it's supposed to do. And so my analysis is, but below that, at a very core level, you have this problem is that there's a certain expectation that the country has a lot of inherent wealth with, through the extractive industries. You should be able to bring a lot of wealth to the surface and then distribute it. And the global economy is moving in a vastly different direction. So over, let's say, the last 9 years that South Africa has had all these political difficulties, the world economy has pivoted dramatically away from extractive industries. You can certainly see that in the coal sectors and others. And all the evidence is there to conclude that trend is going to continue, and that economies that are extractive-based are in a lot of trouble. And that serves to undermine the political processes, which are really about, well, how do we share the wealth? And they're not about how do we create the wealth, and that's where we're stuck.
All right, but interesting, I'd like to hear what your views are on beneficiation.
So beneficiation is a term that you hear a lot in South Africa and other parts of sub-Saharan Africa. But the term doesn't get used anywhere else in the world. I mean, it comes from chemistry, I think. And it's basically about you should add value to products from where the raw materials are extracted. And it almost never makes any sense. It's almost always cheaper to ship the raw materials and then produce the goods closer to the consumers. Not always, but generally that's how it works. It's much more expensive to ship a car than it is, 2 tons of, coal or iron ore, things of that nature, which you would use to produce energy and then the metal to produce the car. So the whole concept of beneficiation is something that top economists in other parts of the world have never heard of, because it doesn't really make any sense. But politically, it's very attractive. The concept of, well, hang on, because we have all these natural resources, that should provide the groundwork to create a lot of jobs and industrialization. It's very appealing politically, but economically, it just doesn't stand up.
You're of the opinion that countries should focus more on how to get more from the value chain, from value creation. I'd like you to speak to that.
Right. So globally, poverty has really plummeted. I mean, over a very long period of time, but particularly over the last 30 years, there's been a really sharp decline in poverty globally. And so if you go and look at how that's happened, the really core thing is, so governance has improved. A lot of it was the end of the Cold War. And so what that then opened the door to, and China was by far the biggest player, was developing countries then employing a lot of people to add value to goods and sometimes services which are then sold to wealthy people or affluent consumers in other parts of the world. And that's a very effective model. It can create, lots and lots of huge jobs, because if countries just very quickly, if you look at China, when they made their big shift in the late 70s, everyone was poor. So they had no choice. They couldn't try to sell to local consumers, and so they followed the path of the neighbors, particularly Japan, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, and they focused on exporting value-added, mostly goods, but some services.
Okay, but I'm curious to know, Shawn, in your estimation, what would you say is the key singular factor blocking the progress of South Africa's growth?
Right. So at the very core, there is this expectation, and it happened in the 1990s in the political transition. Sort of the unstated social contract was that broad prosperity would be created through redistribution, and historically privileged members of society, the minority, they would benefit from there being a much healthier political climate. And politically and morally, that makes plenty of sense. It just doesn't work economically. It can't be made to work, and it's a numbers thing. It would just take so long. There's only so much purchasing power that South African consumers have, and there's just so many unemployed people. And the rest of the world has figured out that doesn't work. I mean, the big thing about the rise of Asia is they figured out, well, if you want to maintain 8, 9, 10% annual growth year after year for decades, you have to, mathematically, you have to export, and it has to be where you employ people, adding value to goods and services. It doesn't work through an extraction-based economy. No one's ever made that work.
All right, but peering through your article, though, I can also see that you're of the opinion that education outcomes are limiting the growth prospects of South Africa.
Right, and everyone buys that. It would be much better if the workforce was much better educated. However, and I do try to get this point come through in the article. It's not as if China made sure they had a well-educated workforce before they began having 10% annual growth rate for 30, 40 years. You need some educated people, very well-educated people, and then if you can find ways, the global economy is actually quite healthy, and there aren't that many low-wage earners in the whole planet. So there are always ways to integrate into the global economy to create a lot of jobs. It's better if the workforce is better educated, but that does not need to be a limited effect. But in the South African political dialogue, it is pretty much a given that you have to educate people effectively first. That actually doesn't hold up. That's not, the empirical evidence does not support that globally. Certainly not the rise of Asia. It wasn't about that.
I've been speaking to Shawn Hagedorn. He's an independent strategy advisor. We'll continue our conversation after the break. Welcome back to Beyond Markets. If you're just joining me, Shawn Hagedorn, an independent strategy advisor, is with me, and we're exploring the adequacy of South Africa's national dialogue ahead of the elections. Before we went on break, you were talking about you made some very interesting points around inequality in South Africa. But I'd like you to speak to the nexus of inequality, poverty, and crime in South Africa, and who is bringing the best type of solutions to this going into the elections.
So inequality is it's mathematical that if you have a certain percentage of your population which has a middle class income, and then you have massive poverty, then you have very high inequality. But the problem isn't that there's too many rich people, it's just that there's far too many poor people. So you have the poverty problem, which is certainly linked, and then you lack social cohesion, and so you get a lot more crime, and that surprises no one. And then in terms of how that plays out politically, and this is where South Africa is, quite frankly, a terrible place, because the way things have evolved, there are so many poor people, and they're mostly, for the most part, they're in rural areas, and they are very dependent, in effect, on government handouts. And then that creates a certain alliance, and that mostly flows to the ruling party, the ANC, and then that creates negative incentives. And you certainly saw that in the Zuma administration, the Zuma policies. And as a result, we've had now basically 10 years of no growth in per capita income. And the ANC is still going to be reelected in all likelihood at the national level in most of the provinces, and maybe all but one.
All right, but I'd like to get your views on what the top contenders bring to the table policy-wise. I know you kind of said, yeah, they don't have a strong policy for growth, but with what's on ground, I'd like you to speak to what they bring to the table policy-wise.
Okay, so the EFF, Julius Malema, economic freedom fighters. So they would be seen as kind of radical leftist populists. And Julius Malema is a very talented politician. His economics are influenced by like Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, who died a few years ago, but whose country is now experiencing extraordinary turmoil. I think more than 10% of the people have left the country just in the last few years. They're going through tremendous turmoil, notwithstanding the fact that they have probably the world's largest reserve of oil. And so then from there there'd be the Democratic Alliance. And the Democratic Alliance, their policies are much more mainstream, orthodox policies, and they basically run on service delivery. In the Western Cape, I live in the Western Cape, I live in Cape Town, it's pretty well managed. And I don't think many people doubt that. I mean, Helen Zille, at one point when she was mayor of Cape Town, she got mayor of the year, globally. That's quite an accomplishment. And then the ANC, they are, if you really step back, they're the Liberation Party, and they're the ones who've been entrusted in sort of redistributing the wealth of the country. And their policies are fixated on that, and they're unworkable. But still, they're going to be reelected, and so South Africa is just kind of stuck in a negative vortex, politically, economically.
All right, but looking at your article, I saw a very interesting line that kind of jumped at me, and I'd like you to speak to this point. You mentioned the fact that you think that government and household debt levels, are too high to fund domestic-led growth. I'd like you to clarify this point and tell me what you're talking to.
And thanks, Ken, for asking that. So there's a terrible problem around that, in that, so the ANC is, they're trying to redistribute wealth equitably. And so their policies are domestically focused, because, if you have an export focused economy, then it doesn't work, because you won't get the foreigners to support that. It's all based on international prices. So the ANC's policies are mostly focused on redistribution, mostly domestic focused, and that means one way or another, you tax consumers, you tax businesses, you create legislation and regulations, and so what happens is the domestic economy can only fuel so much growth. It can fuel more if households take on more debt, but in effect, you can only do that once. And then the households become over-indebted, and then the situation becomes much worse. And we are way down that path. Households are vastly over-indebted. And so if you look at it this way, just simple numbers, let's say a household, their income, a third of it goes to service consumer debt, car loans and things like that. And let's say the interest rate is 25, 30% or something like that. If their wages are only increasing at the rate of inflation, they're getting poorer all the time. And that's why you have these pretty aggressive strikes and whatnot. Because really what is baked into the cake, deep into the cake across the economy, is that households are becoming worse off more often than not. And that is a very serious challenge.
All right, but when you listen to the last State of the Nation address, by the president, I'd like you to speak to some of the key top economic issues that comes to your mind and that needs to be addressed.
I thought there was a lot in Cyril Ramaphosa's State of the Nation address, which was encouraging. Most particularly is focusing on the need to increase exports, which is what I'm talking about. And I mean, to be fair, I think the DA may have been a bit ahead of the ANC in moving that direction, but it's harder for the ANC to move in that direction. They're the ruling party, and they're pretty much expected to focus on redistribution. And Cyril Ramaphosa, President Ramaphosa, also focused on increasing tourism. And tourism is, it's obviously a beautiful place. It's far away from a lot of the wealthy consumers, but it works really well all around, and you can tap into global wallets, so to speak, and yet a lot of the redistribution programs work, and you can employ a lot of not very well educated people. So tourism is fabulous. He talks about doubling that in just over 10 years. Whether that's doable, it seems unlikely, but it's a good thing to focus on. And more people should come to South Africa. It's a wonderful place.
All right, but when you look at the key contenders, are you hearing some very innovative ideas on how to improve on government revenues?
No, not at all. And if you go deeper, it's like what criteria should be used. I mean, Cyril Ramaphosa, to his credit, is trying to shift the ANC policy-making machine more towards exports. And that is a big ask. It's exactly what has to happen. If you look at the rise of Asia, one of the most amazing things in the history of humanity, that's what drove it. And South Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa needs to do that. And so you need to change the criteria. You need to change the dialogue, which is the language I use, to say, hang on, we are going to integrate within the global economy. And if you look at the international relations of South Africa, I mean, you talk about Venezuela, Zimbabwe, from a lot of other countries' perspectives, they would put South Africa in there, and they would put them in the category of countries whose interests and outlooks are at odds with, let's say, the Western approach, which is where most of the consumers are.
All right, but now let's look at the top, metropolitan municipalities in South Africa and what their key needs are going into this election.
Right. So the engine room, as they say, of the South African economy is Gauteng. That's where Johannesburg and Pretoria are. And so you have a lot of middle-class people who live in that area, and more black than white. And a lot has been accomplished since democratic rule in '94. And the Western Cape, different demographic mix, much more colored people here. But those two areas, I mean, if the whole country is like that, they'd be vastly different. But like a lot of countries in the world, then you have the rural areas where the prospects are vastly limited, and it's harder to push out services. It's harder to provide education and job opportunities. That's where we are, and it's not viable going forward.
Okay, but when you look at these elections and the build-up to the elections, would you say this is the biggest challenge or test for the ANC since it came into power?
Their approach was never going to work, okay? There was always way too much focus on redistribution, way too little focus on integrating with the global economy. And now they've just, you can't fund the government anymore going forward. Something has to change. So I would put it that way. They really have to change how they do business. But of course, they have so much internal strife, they're not even taking that up realistically. So that's why there's really no reason to be positive about the election.
All right, but what has been going on with all the infighting in the ruling party, though?
So, political analysts will go on about this ad nauseum. There's a lot to talk about. But I mean, basically, the Zuma patronage government, neo-patronalism, he created a huge patronage machine. So people were loyal to him because he favored those people who were loyal to him. And there's nothing new about this. And it works much better in extraction-based economies. But it doesn't work well in high-growth economies which are integrated in the global economy. So there's that group in the ANC, and then there's the Ramaphosa reformer groups who want to do what's right for the country. And so we don't even know. And so it's something maybe people across Africa wouldn't fully appreciate. So in South Africa, you don't vote for the people. You do that in a lot of other democracies. Here you vote for the party. And then the party can later decide, no, we said that was going to be our top person, but we changed our mind. And so Mbeki has to step aside, or Zuma has to step aside. And the same thing could happen with Cyril Ramaphosa, although not immediately, but a couple, 3 years down the line. So there's a lot of internal strife that needs to be managed within the ANC.
I've been speaking to Shawn Hagedorn. He's an independent strategy advisor. And that's it on Beyond Markets for today. And thank you so much for joining us. Remember, you can watch the show at 5 p.m. West African time daily and have access to all previous episodes of Beyond Markets on our website at cnbcafrica.com. You can also stay engaged with the hashtag Beyond Markets, and you can follow me at Kenneth Igbomo. Have a wonderful day.